In the heart of Montana's rugged landscape, where winter winds cut through a man's soul like a sharp blade, there lived a cowboy who had built walls higher than the mountains surrounding his ranch. Jake Morrison had turned down 17 marriage proposals in 5 years, each rejection delivered with the same cold politeness that had become his trademark. The townspeople whispered that he was cursed, that some tragedy had frozen his heart beyond repair. But on a December evening, when the snow fell like tears from heaven, a schoolteacher named Sarah Chen would walk into Murphy's saloon and ask him a question that would shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. Her words would echo through the frozen air like a gunshot. "Do you want a wife, Jake Morrison, or are you planning to spend every winter for the rest of your life talking to your cattle and pretending that loneliness doesn't eat you alive from the inside out?" What happened next would become the most talked about love story in 3 counties, a tale of 2 stubborn hearts learning that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is admit they need someone else. This is the story of how a question posed in desperation became the key that unlocked a cowboy's guarded heart, and how love found its way into the most unlikely places during the harshest winter Montana had seen in 50 years. Jake Morrison stood 6 feet 4 in his worn leather boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his 1,000-acre ranch, and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from the same granite that formed the Rocky Mountains. His hands, scarred from years of handling barbed wire and breaking horses, could gentle a spooked colt or throw a calf for branding with equal skill. At 32, he owned the second-largest cattle operation in Glacier County, Montana, and had a bank account that most folks could only dream about. He also had a reputation that made the local ladies' auxiliary whisper behind their coffee cups every Sunday after church. The first woman who proposed to Jake was Rebecca Walsh, the banker's daughter with corn-silk hair and a trust fund that could buy half the county. She cornered him outside the feed store on a bright April morning in 2018, wearing a yellow dress that matched the daffodils blooming in her mama's garden. Her proposal was as carefully planned as her daddy's loan applications, complete with a list of reasons why they would make a perfect match. Jake listened politely, his hat in his hands, while she explained how their combined properties would create an empire spanning 3 counties. When she finished, he thanked her kindly and told her he wasn't the marrying type. The rejection was gentle but firm, like his voice when he talked to skittish horses. Rebecca wasn't the last. There was Mary Catherine Sullivan, whose family had run the general store for 3 generations. She proposed during the county fair, right next to the Ferris wheel, with half the town watching and the other half pretending not to. Jake's answer was the same polite no, delivered with the kind of respect that somehow made the rejection hurt worse than anger would have. Then came Jennifer Hartley, who taught kindergarten and baked pies that won blue ribbons at every church social. She asked him to marry her on Christmas Eve, standing in the snow outside the Methodist church after midnight service. The Christmas lights reflected in her hopeful eyes as she spoke about the family they could build together. Jake's refusal was so gentle that she almost thanked him for it. By the time Jake had turned down his 17th proposal, the people of Whitefish, Montana had developed theories about their most eligible bachelor. Some said he was still mourning his high school sweetheart who died in a car accident 10 years earlier. Others whispered that he preferred the company of men, though his occasional appearances with women from neighboring towns suggested otherwise. The more romantic souls claimed he was waiting for true love, while the practical folks figured he was just too set in his ways to share his life with anyone. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any of their theories. Jake Morrison was afraid. He had grown up in a house where love was a weapon, where his father used affection like a carrot and withdrew it like a stick. Samuel Morrison had been a man who measured worth in acres and head of cattle, who praised his son when the book showed a profit, and turned cold as winter when anything went wrong. Jake's mother, Eleanor, had loved her husband with the kind of desperate devotion that destroyed a woman piece by piece. She had died when Jake was 22, worn down by years of trying to earn love from a man who saw her as just another asset to manage. After the funeral, Jake had sworn he would never put himself in a position to love someone that much, or to have someone depend on him that completely. He had seen what that kind of love could do to people, how it could turn them into shadows of themselves. So he built his walls high and kept his heart locked away, telling himself that independence was strength and that needing someone was the first step toward losing yourself. His ranch became his refuge and his prison. The Flying M spread across rolling hills dotted with lodgepole pines and natural springs that never froze, even in the deepest winter. The main house was a log structure his grandfather had built with his own hands, expanded over the years until it could comfortably house a family of 8. But Jake lived there alone, except for his border collie, Rex, and the occasional ranch hand who stayed in the bunkhouse during calving season. Jake's days started before sunrise with coffee black as motor oil and strong enough to wake the dead. He would check on the cattle, repair whatever fence the wind or wildlife had damaged, and handle the endless paperwork that came with running a modern ranch. His evenings were spent reading livestock journals or veterinary manuals, planning for the next season, or working on some project that would improve the operation. He told himself he was content. The ranch was prospering under his management, his cattle were healthy, and his bank account grew steadily larger each year. He had friends in town, men he could share a beer with at Murphy's Saloon, or talk shop with at the feed store. He had his freedom, his independence, and his privacy. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the house creaked around him like an old man's bones, Jake sometimes felt the weight of his solitude pressing down on him like a physical thing. He would walk through rooms that echoed with emptiness, past a dining table that seated 8 but only ever had one place setting, past bedrooms that gathered dust because no one ever slept in them. During those moments, he would remember Rebecca Walsh's earnest face as she explained her business plan for their future. He would think about Mary Catherine's laugh, bright as silver bells, and the way Jennifer Hartley's eyes lit up when she talked about the children they could raise together. But then he would remember his mother's tears, hidden behind a smile she wore like armor, and his father's cold silence that could freeze a room in July. The pattern of proposals and rejections might have continued indefinitely if not for Sarah Chen, though Jake didn't know her name the first time he saw her. It was a Tuesday in late October, and he was in town picking up supplies when a small woman with straight black hair and determined eyes marched past Murphy's Saloon, carrying a stack of books that reached her chin. She was arguing with herself in what sounded like 3 different languages, gesturing emphatically with her free hand while trying to balance her literary tower. Jake paused in loading feed sacks into his truck to watch her navigate the uneven sidewalk with the focus of a tightrope walker. She was pretty in a no-nonsense way, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of practical clothing that suggested she valued function over fashion. There was something about her determined stride and the set of her shoulders that suggested she was not a woman who gave up easily. "That's the new school teacher," said Bill Murphy, appearing beside Jake's truck with a cup of coffee steaming in the cold air. "Sarah Chen. Came here from Seattle to teach 5th grade. Smart as a whip, according to Helen Gardner, and twice as stubborn." Jake watched Sarah Chen disappear around the corner, her book still perfectly balanced, despite her animated conversation with herself. Something about the sight of her made him smile, though he couldn't quite say why. "Seems like she's got her hands full," Jake observed, returning to his loading. "That she does," Bill agreed. "Been here 2 months now, and she's already reorganized the school library, started a chess club, and convinced the town council to fund a science fair. Helen says she's got more energy than a barrel full of cats." Jake nodded politely and finished loading his truck. But he found himself thinking about the new school teacher as he drove back to the ranch. There had been something compelling about her focused intensity, the way she seemed to be fully engaged with whatever thoughts were occupying her mind. Most people Jake encountered moved through their days with a kind of sleepwalking quality, going through familiar motions without really being present.
Sarah Chen had looked like a woman who was completely alive to every moment.
He didn't think about her again until the following Friday, when he stopped by the general store and found her standing in the cereal aisle, reading the nutrition labels with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. "Excuse me?" she said without looking up from a box of cornflakes. "You wouldn't happen to know if there's anywhere in this town to buy quinoa, would you?" Jake blinked, processing both the question and the fact that she was talking to him. "Quinoa? It's a grain. Well, technically it's a seed, but it cooks like a grain. High in protein, good source of fiber, contains all 9 essential amino acids." She looked up at him then, and he was struck by the directness of her gaze. "I'm trying to introduce my students to foods from different cultures, and quinoa is originally from South America. The Incas called it the mother of all grains." "I don't think Sullivan's carries it," Jake said slowly. "You might try the health food store in Kalispell. That's 40 minutes each way," Sarah said, frowning at the cornflakes as if they had personally disappointed her. "There has to be a better solution." Jake found himself saying, "I could pick some up for you next time I'm in Kalispell. I go there every couple of weeks for ranch supplies." Sarah looked at him with genuine surprise. "You would do that? You don't even know me." "I know you're the new teacher," Jake said. "And that you're trying to teach kids about different cultures seems like a worthy cause." For the first time since he'd seen her, Sarah Chen smiled. It was like watching the sun come out from behind clouds. transforming her entire face. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Morrison, Jake Morrison, Sarah Chen, and thank you, Jake Morrison. That would be wonderful." They arranged for Jake to drop the quinoa by the school the following week, and he drove home thinking that Sarah Chen was nothing like the other women who had shown interest in him. She was practical and direct, with no hint of the coy flirtation or calculated charm he had learned to recognize and avoid. She had asked for help with a specific problem and accepted his offer with straightforward gratitude. The exchange should have been forgettable, a minor courtesy between neighbors, but Jake found himself looking forward to their quinoa transaction with an anticipation that surprised him. There was something about Sarah Chen's focused intelligence and unselfconscious enthusiasm that intrigued him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Winter was coming to Montana, as it always did, with the inevitability of death and taxes. The nights were getting longer, the mornings colder, and the cattle were growing their thick winter coats. Jake prepared for the season as he always did, stocking up on hay and feed, checking his equipment and settling in for the long, solitary months ahead. But this year, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Jake Morrison found himself wondering what it might be like to have someone to share those quiet winter evenings with, someone who could make him smile without even trying, who looked at the world with curiosity instead of calculation. He told himself it was just the approaching loneliness of winter making him think such thoughts. After all, he had turned down 17 perfectly good women who would have been happy to share his life and his ranch. He wasn't about to start getting foolish ideas about a schoolteacher who probably saw him as nothing more than a convenient quinoa delivery service. But as Jake settled into his empty house that night, listening to the wind beginning to howl around the eaves, he couldn't quite shake the memory of Sarah Chen's smile or the feeling that something was about to change in his carefully ordered world. Sarah Chen had come to Montana with a broken heart and a determination to rebuild her life in a place where nobody knew her history. At 29, she had already lived through enough disappointment to fill several lifetimes. Her ex-fiancé David had called off their engagement 3 weeks before their wedding, explaining with clinical detachment that he had realized they wanted different things from life. What he hadn't mentioned until later was that he had been having an affair with his research partner for the better part of a year. The discovery had shattered more than just Sarah's wedding plans. It had destroyed her faith in her own judgment and left her questioning everything she thought she knew about love, commitment, and her future. After spending 2 months crying into her sister's couch cushions in Seattle, Sarah had decided that what she needed was a complete change of scenery and a job that would consume all her energy. The teaching position in Whitefish, Montana had seemed perfect. It was far from Seattle, in a small town where she could make a real difference, and the salary was decent enough to let her pay off her student loans while saving money for whatever came next. She had packed her Honda Civic with everything she owned and driven east toward the mountains, leaving behind the life she had planned for one she would have to create from scratch. The first 2 months in Whitefish had been exactly what she needed. Her 5th grade class was a delightful mix of ranch kids and town children, each one bringing their own unique perspective to the classroom. There was Tommy Brennan, whose family raised sheep, and who could calculate feed ratios in his head faster than Sarah could work them out on paper. Emma Rodriguez knew more about local wildlife than most park rangers, and could identify animal tracks in the mud with the confidence of a detective examining fingerprints. Sarah threw herself into teaching with the enthusiasm of someone who had found her calling. She reorganized the outdated science curriculum, started a chess club that met after school, and convinced the somewhat skeptical town council to fund a science fair that would showcase student projects. Her classroom became a hub of activity, filled with interesting experiments, cultural celebrations, and the kind of engaged learning that made education feel like an adventure rather than a chore. But for all her professional satisfaction, Sarah's personal life remained essentially empty. She had rented a small apartment above the bakery on Main Street, furnished with cast-offs from the school and items she had found at garage sales. Her evenings were spent grading papers, preparing lessons, or reading books from the surprisingly well-stocked town library. She had made pleasant acquaintances but no real friends, and her social interactions rarely extended beyond polite conversations about the weather or her students' progress. The loneliness hadn't bothered her at first. After the chaos and emotional exhaustion of her breakup with David, the quiet solitude had felt healing. She was rediscovering who she was when she wasn't half of a couple, learning to enjoy her own company without the constant need for external validation. But as autumn deepened into winter and the days grew shorter, Sarah began to feel the isolation more acutely. It was during one of those increasingly long evenings that she first heard about Jake Morrison and his legendary string of marriage rejections. Sarah was having dinner at Murphy's Saloon, grading papers while she ate a surprisingly good beef stew when the conversation at the next table caught her attention. 17 women. Helen Gardner was saying to her companion, shaking her grey head in bewilderment. 17 perfectly nice women, and he's turned down every last one of them. Rebecca Walsh, Mary Catherine Sullivan, Jennifer Hartley, and 14 others. Each one prettier and more accomplished than the last. Maybe he's just particular, suggested her friend, Martha Conway. Particular is one thing, Helen replied, but this is something else entirely. That boy is going to end up old and alone, talking to his cattle for company. Mark my words, Martha. There's something eating at Jake Morrison that goes deeper than being particular about a wife. Sarah found herself listening with growing fascination as Helen recounted the saga of Jake's romantic rejections. According to the local gossip network, Jake Morrison was everything a woman could want in a husband. Handsome, successful, kind to animals and children, and possessed of the kind of steady reliability that made for a good partner. Yet he seemed determined to remain single, no matter how many suitable women threw themselves at his feet. The story intrigued Sarah in a way she couldn't quite explain. She had always been drawn to puzzles, to problems that needed solving, and Jake Morrison sounded like the most complex puzzle in 3 counties. What made a man turn down 17 marriage proposals? What was he afraid of, or what was he protecting? Her curiosity was further piqued the following Friday when Jake Morrison himself offered to buy quinoa for her students' cultural food project. The gesture was unexpected and genuinely kind, coming from someone who had no reason to help a stranger. Sarah had expected to have to drive to Kalispell herself, adding another item to her already overwhelming weekend to-do list. Instead, this mysterious cowboy had volunteered to solve her problem without asking for anything in return. When Jake arrived at the school the following Tuesday with not just quinoa but also information about where to find other specialty ingredients, Sarah realized that her initial impression of him had been incomplete. He wasn't just tall and handsome in the rugged way that seemed standard for Montana ranchers. There was an intelligence in his eyes and a thoughtfulness in his manner that suggested hidden depths. The health food store manager gave me a list of other grains and spices they carry, Jake said, handing her a carefully written inventory along with the quinoa. Thought it might help with your cultural food project. Sarah studied the list, impressed by the thoroughness of his research. This is wonderful. Look, they have teff from Ethiopia and farro from Italy, and even some spices I wasn't sure I could find outside of a major city. You went to a lot of trouble for this. Jake shrugged, but there was something almost shy in his expression. Didn't take much extra effort, and education's important. Kids should learn about the world beyond their own backyard. You sound like you have some experience with that, Sarah observed. I went to Montana State for agricultural business, Jake said. Had roommates from all over the world. Learned more from eating their food and hearing their stories than I did in half my classes. They talked for a few more minutes about travel and education, and Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation. Jake Morrison was articulate and well-read, with opinions that went beyond cattle prices and weather patterns. He asked thoughtful questions about her teaching methods and seemed genuinely interested in her students' progress. But just as Sarah was beginning to think that the local gossips might be wrong about Jake Morrison being antisocial, he seemed to catch himself. His friendly demeanor shifted back to polite distance, and he made his excuses about needing to get back to the ranch. The change was so abrupt that Sarah wondered if she had said something wrong, or if Jake Morrison was as skittish about personal connections as the local women suggested. The brief encounter left Sarah more curious than ever about the enigmatic rancher. Over the following weeks, she found herself paying attention to local conversations about Jake, piecing together fragments of information like an anthropologist studying a particularly elusive subject. She learned that Jake's parents had died several years apart, leaving him to run the family ranch alone. She discovered that he was considered scrupulously honest in his business dealings and generous with neighbors who needed help during difficult times. She heard stories about him rescuing stranded motorists during blizzards, lending equipment to farmers whose machinery had broken down, and quietly paying veterinary bills for families who couldn't afford to treat sick animals. The portrait that emerged was of a man who cared deeply about his community, but kept himself apart from it, who was willing to help others but unwilling to accept help himself. Sarah recognized the pattern because she had lived it herself in the months following her breakup with David. It was the behavior of someone who had been hurt badly and was determined not to risk being hurt again. The recognition stirred something protective in Sarah, along with a growing desire to understand what had wounded Jake Morrison so deeply that he would rather face Montana winters alone than risk opening his heart to another person. Her opportunity came in early December, when a fierce blizzard stranded her at the school after a parent-teacher conference that ran late. Sarah had planned to drive home to her apartment, but the wind was howling like a banshee, and the snow was falling so thick she couldn't see a car in the parking lot, much less the road. She was resigned to spending the night in her classroom when she heard someone knocking on the school's front door. Through the frosted glass, she could make out the silhouette of a tall man in a heavy coat. And when she opened the door, Jake Morrison stumbled inside with Rex at his heels, both of them covered in snow. "Saw your car in the lot," Jake said, stomping his feet and shaking snow from his coat. "Roads are impassable. You can't drive home in this." "I was planning to sleep in my classroom," Sarah said. "I have a sleeping bag in my supply closet for camping trips with the kids." Jake looked at her as if she had suggested sleeping in a snowbank. "The heat gets turned down to 50 degrees at night. You'll freeze. Come on, I'll take you to the ranch." "I couldn't impose," Sarah began, but Jake cut her off. "It's not an imposition, it's common sense. I've got a 4-wheel drive truck with chains, and the ranch is only 10 minutes from here if you know the back roads. You can stay in the guest room until the roads are clear." Sarah wanted to argue, but the practical part of her mind recognized the wisdom of his suggestion. The school would indeed be uncomfortably cold, and she had no food beyond the granola bar in her purse. More importantly, there was something reassuring about Jake's matter-of-fact competence in dealing with the crisis. The drive to the Flying M Ranch was an adventure in itself, with Jake's truck pushing through drifts that would have swallowed Sarah's Honda entirely. The ranch house appeared out of the swirling snow like something from a fairy tale, warm light glowing from its windows and smoke rising from the chimney into the wild night. Inside, the house was everything Sarah had expected and nothing she had prepared for. It was beautifully appointed but clearly designed for a large family, with a kitchen that could feed an army and a living room dominated by a stone fireplace that could have roasted a whole cow. But despite its size and obvious quality, the house felt hollow, as if it were waiting for voices to fill its rooms and laughter to warm its corners. Jake made coffee and heated up leftover stew while Sarah called the school to let them know she wouldn't be in early the next morning. The conversation was easy and natural, ranging from books to travel to the challenges of rural education. Jake was an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that revealed both intelligence and empathy. But even in his own home, Sarah could sense Jake keeping part of himself in reserve, maintaining a careful distance even as he played the perfect host. It was as if he had developed the social skills to be charming and welcoming without ever allowing anyone to get too close to who he really was underneath. As the evening progressed and the storm continued to rage outside, Sarah found herself studying Jake when he wasn't looking, trying to understand the contradiction he represented. Here was a man who had everything most people wanted: success, security, good looks, and enough money to live comfortably. Yet he seemed determined to experience it all alone, as if he believed that sharing his good fortune would somehow diminish it. The guest room Jake showed her to was comfortable and impersonal, like a nice hotel room. It had obviously been prepared for visitors, but Sarah got the impression that very few people had actually slept there. As she settled in for the night, listening to the wind howl around the house and the occasional creak of settling timber, Sarah found herself wondering what it would be like to live in such a beautiful place with only her own thoughts for company. The next morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, with snow covering the landscape like a pristine white blanket. Jake made pancakes and bacon for breakfast, and they ate while watching the sunrise paint the mountains pink and gold through the kitchen windows. It was the kind of peaceful morning that made Sarah understand why people chose to live in places like Montana, despite the harsh winters and isolation. But as Jake drove her back to town to collect her car, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something profound and sad during her brief stay at the Flying M. Jake Morrison wasn't just a bachelor by choice, she realized. He was a man who had convinced himself that loneliness was preferable to the risk of being truly known by another person. The insight stayed with Sarah through the busy weeks leading up to Christmas break. She found herself thinking about Jake at odd moments, wondering what had happened to make him so afraid of intimacy that he would choose solitude over companionship. She began to understand why 17 women had proposed to him, and why each one had been turned away with the same gentle but implacable refusal. Jake Morrison wasn't just handsome and successful. He was also kind, intelligent, and possessed of the sort of quiet strength that made people feel safe in his presence. But all of those attractive qualities were wrapped in emotional armor so thick that no one had yet figured out how to penetrate it. As Christmas approached and the winter deepened, Sarah found herself making a decision that would have shocked her former self. She was going to find a way to ask Jake Morrison the question that no one else had thought to ask. Not whether he would marry them, but why he was so determined to face the future alone. It was a dangerous impulse, she knew. Sarah had come to Montana to heal from her own romantic disappointments, not to take on someone else's emotional baggage. But something about Jake's carefully maintained isolation called to her. Perhaps because she recognized in him the same fear that had driven her to pack her car and flee across 3 states. The difference was that Sarah had learned something important during her months of self-imposed exile. Sometimes the biggest risk in life wasn't opening your heart to another person, but keeping it closed so long that you forgot how to love at all. The day Sarah Chen walked into Murphy's saloon with fire in her eyes and determination in her step. The temperature outside was 15 degrees below zero and dropping. Christmas had come and gone, leaving behind empty boxes and the hollow feeling that always followed the holidays in small towns. The new year had arrived with a blizzard that buried Whitefish under 3 feet of snow and left the entire county feeling trapped and restless. Jake Morrison was nursing his second beer at his usual table in the corner, trying to ignore the increasingly loud conversation at the bar, where Tom Bradley was holding forth about the virtues of his daughter Angela, who had just graduated from nursing school and was looking for a nice man to settle down with. It was the same conversation Jake had been hearing in various forms for years, and he knew it would only be a matter of time before someone suggested he ought to meet this wonderful girl who would make him such a good wife. He was considering making his escape when the saloon door burst open with enough force to rattle the windows, and Sarah Chen marched in like a woman on a mission. She was wearing a thick red wool coat covered in snow, wool mittens, and a hat that looked like it had been knitted by someone's grandmother. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her glasses were slightly fogged, and there was something in her posture that suggested she had come to settle a score. The entire saloon went quiet as Sarah scanned the room with the focused intensity of a hunter tracking prey. Her gaze swept over the usual Friday night crowd, past the farmers complaining about feed prices and the ranchers discussing the weather, until it landed on Jake's table in the corner. For a moment that felt like eternity. They stared at each other across the smoky room while everyone else held their breath. Then Sarah walked straight toward him with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent days building up courage for this moment and wasn't going to let it slip away. She stopped directly in front of his table, pulled off her mittens with sharp, deliberate movements, and placed both hands flat on the scarred wooden surface. "Jake Morrison," she said in a voice that carried clearly through the silent saloon. "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." Jake felt his heart start beating faster, though he couldn't quite say why. There was something in Sarah's tone that suggested this wasn't going to be a casual conversation about quinoa or cultural food projects. "All right," he said carefully. "What's your question?" Sarah took a deep breath, and Jake could see her gathering herself like a runner preparing for a difficult race. Around them, the other patrons had given up any pretense of minding their own business and were openly staring at the drama unfolding in the corner. "Do you want a wife, Jake Morrison?" Sarah said with the quiet intensity of someone stating a fundamental truth. "Or are you planning to spend every winter for the rest of your life talking to your cattle and pretending that loneliness doesn't eat you alive from the inside out?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and sending his carefully constructed defenses crashing down around him. In all the years of polite proposals and gentle rejections, no one had ever asked him that. They had asked him to marry them, to love them, to share his life and his ranch and his future. But no one had ever looked past his refusals to ask what he actually wanted, what he was afraid of, or what price he was paying for his determined solitude. The silence in the saloon stretched until Jake could hear the wind whistling around the building and the quiet hiss of beer being poured at the bar. Every eye in the place was focused on him, waiting to see how the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties would respond to the most direct question anyone had ever asked him about his love life. "Sarah," Jake began, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I'm not proposing to you," she said firmly. "I'm not asking you to marry me or date me or even have dinner with me. I'm asking you a question about what you want from your life because I've been watching you for months now and I think you're lying to yourself about being happy alone." Jake felt exposed, as if Sarah had somehow seen through all his careful pretenses to the raw loneliness he had been hiding for years. Part of him wanted to get up and walk out, to retreat to the safety of his ranch where no one could corner him with uncomfortable truths. But something in Sarah's eyes held him in place, a combination of compassion and challenge that made running feel like cowardice. "What makes you think you know anything about what I want?" Jake asked, his voice rougher than he had intended. Sarah pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without invitation, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who had thought long and hard about what she was going to say. "Because I recognize the signs," she said. "I know what it looks like when someone is so afraid of being hurt again that they convince themselves they don't need anyone. I know because I've been doing the same thing." Around them, the saloon had become so quiet that Jake could hear the clock ticking behind the bar and the whispered conversations of people trying to listen, without appearing to eavesdrop. He realized that this conversation was going to become legendary in Whitefish the night the new schoolteacher confronted Jake Morrison about his bachelor status in front of half the town. "You don't know anything about my situation," Jake said, but even to his own ears, the protest sounded weak. "Don't I?" Sarah challenged. "You live alone in a house big enough for 8 people. You have friends but no close friends. Colleagues but no confidants. You're kind to everyone and intimate with no one. You've turned down 17 marriage proposals from women who would have loved you, not because they weren't good enough, but because you're terrified of letting anyone close enough to hurt you." Each word landed with surgical precision, cutting through Jake's defenses like a scalpel through skin. He wanted to deny her accusations, to tell her she was wrong about him and his motives, but the truth was written in the hollow echo of his empty house and the conversations he had with his dog, because there was no one else to talk to. "Even if that were true," Jake said slowly, "what business is it of yours?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, and some of the fire went out of her posture. For the first time since she had marched into the saloon, she looked uncertain, almost vulnerable.
"Because I care about you," she said quietly.
"Not romantically, not as someone who wants to marry you and fix you and make you into someone different, but as a friend who sees you choosing loneliness when you could choose connection." The simple honesty of her statement hit Jake harder than all her challenges and accusations. When was the last time someone had said they cared about him without wanting something in return? When was the last time someone had seen past his success and good looks to the person he actually was underneath? "Why do you care?" Jake asked, genuinely curious. "You barely know me." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded on the table. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Because I spent the first 3 months I lived here doing exactly what you're doing. Keeping everyone at arm's length, convincing myself I was better off alone, building walls so high that no one could climb over them." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "I came here after my fiancé called off our wedding 3 weeks before the ceremony. He'd been having an affair with his research partner, and I was so devastated and humiliated that I convinced myself I never wanted to risk loving anyone again. I was going to be the independent woman who didn't need anyone, who was perfectly content with her career and her books and her solitude." Jake found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself by the raw honesty in Sarah's voice. Around them, the saloon had become a theater, with everyone straining to hear this intimate confession being played out in public. "But you know what I discovered during my months of proud independence?" Sarah continued. "Loneliness doesn't make you stronger. It doesn't protect you from being hurt. It just makes you smaller and sadder and more afraid until you forget what it feels like to be truly happy." Her words resonated through Jake like struck bells, awakening echoes he had spent years trying to silence. He thought about his empty house, his conversations with Rex, the way he measured time not by meaningful moments but by the repetitive cycles of ranch work and solitary evenings. "So, what changed your mind?" Jake asked. Sarah smiled then, the first genuine smile he had seen from her all evening. "Christmas dinner at Helen Gardner's house. She invited me because she said no one should spend Christmas alone, and I almost didn't go because I told myself I was fine by myself. But I went, and you know what happened?" Jake shook his head. "I remembered what it felt like to be part of something, to have people ask about my day and care about the answer, to laugh until my stomach hurt, and to feel like I belonged somewhere." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "And I realized that independence isn't about never needing anyone. It's about choosing who you want to need and who you want to need you back." The truth of her statement settled over Jake like a warm blanket, comforting and terrifying at the same time. He had spent so many years equating emotional independence with strength that he had forgotten the difference between being self-sufficient and being isolated.
"You still haven't answered my question," Sarah said gently.
"Do you want a wife, Jake Morrison? Not the idea of a wife, not someone to cook and clean and look pretty at social events, but a real partner, someone who knows you completely and chooses to stay anyway. Someone to share the good times and the bad times, the daily routines and the big dreams." Jake stared at her across the table, this small, fierce woman who had somehow seen through all his carefully constructed defenses to the truth he had been hiding even from himself. The honest answer to her question rose in his throat like a confession, years of suppressed longing demanding to be acknowledged. "Yes," he said so quietly that only Sarah could hear him. Then, louder, with more conviction. Yes, I want that. I want it so much it scares the hell out of me. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither one was sure they wanted to cross. Around them, Jake could hear the resumption of normal conversation as people realized the show was over and went back to their own Friday night concerns. But at their table, the air crackled with the tension of a truth finally spoken. "What scares you about it?" Sarah asked. Jake was quiet for a long time, searching for words to explain fears he had never articulated before. "My parents," he finally said. "They had the kind of marriage that destroyed them both. My father was cold and controlling, and my mother loved him so much she lost herself trying to please him. I watched her shrink a little more every year until there was nothing left of who she used to be." Sarah nodded with understanding. "And you're afraid you'll turn into your father, or that you'll marry someone who disappears like your mother did." "Exactly." The relief of being understood, truly understood, was almost overwhelming. "I've convinced myself that staying alone is the noble choice, the safe choice. But lately you're wondering if safe is just another word for scared," Sarah finished. Jake laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "When did you get so wise about these things?" "When I spent 3 months making the same mistakes you've been making for years," Sarah said. "The difference is, I had someone who cared enough about me to call me on my nonsense. Helen Gardner cornered me after Christmas dinner and told me I was being an idiot if I thought I could find happiness by avoiding all possibility of unhappiness." "And you listened to her?" "Eventually. After I'd argued with her for 2 hours about the virtues of independence and self-sufficiency." Sarah grinned. "She finally told me that being alone by choice was fine, but being alone because you're too scared to take a chance on happiness was just another form of cowardice." The word cowardice hit Jake like a slap, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. For all his success as a rancher and his reputation as a solid, dependable man, he had been running from emotional risk for years. "So what are you suggesting?" Jake asked. "That I propose to the next woman who walks through that door." Sarah laughed, a sound like silver bells that drew smiles from the other patrons even though they couldn't hear the conversation. "I'm suggesting that you stop hiding behind your fear and start living like someone who deserves to be happy. Make friends, real friends who know who you are underneath the successful rancher facade. Take risks, small ones at first. Let people care about you without assuming they want something from you. And if I do all that and still end up hurt," Sarah's expression grew serious, "then you'll be hurt, but you'll also have lived, really lived, instead of just existing. And maybe if you're very lucky and very brave, you'll find someone who's worth the risk." Jake studied her face in the dim light of the saloon. This woman who had somehow become important to him without his realizing when or how it happened. There was kindness in her eyes, but also challenge, an invitation to become the man he could be instead of remaining the man he had settled for being. "Why do I get the feeling this conversation isn't really about marriage proposals?" Jake asked. Sarah's cheeks flushed pink, but she met his gaze steadily. "Because you're smarter than you pretend to be. This conversation is about two people who are tired of being afraid and wondering if maybe it's time to try something different." The implication hung in the air between them, like a question waiting to be answered. Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized that Sarah Chen wasn't just offering him advice about his love life. She was offering him a chance, an opportunity to practice being brave with someone who understood what it felt like to be scared. The morning after Sarah's confrontation at Murphy's saloon, Jake Morrison woke up feeling like a man who had survived a natural disaster. Every muscle in his body ached as if he had been thrown from a horse, and his head pounded with the intensity of someone who had drunk too much whiskey, though he had barely touched his beer the night before. The emotional earthquake that Sarah Chen had triggered in his carefully ordered world had left him feeling exposed and uncertain, like someone who had been living in a house only to discover the foundation was made of sand. He went through his morning routine mechanically, feeding the cattle and checking water lines with the distant efficiency of someone whose mind was occupied elsewhere. Rex followed him with unusual concern, the border collie's intelligent eyes tracking his master's distracted movements with the wariness of an animal who sensed that something fundamental had shifted in their world. The conversation at Murphy's kept playing through Jake's mind, like a song stuck on repeat. Sarah's words had stripped away years of careful self-deception, forcing him to confront truths he had spent considerable energy avoiding. The worst part wasn't that she had been right about his loneliness and fear. The worst part was that her honesty had awakened something in him that he had thought was safely buried, a longing for connection that made his solitary existence feel suddenly unbearable. By noon, Jake had made a decision that would have terrified him just 24 hours earlier. He was going to take Sarah up on her implicit offer to practice being brave. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was getting himself into. He drove to town with the determination of someone setting out to perform surgery on himself, knowing it was necessary but dreading the pain. The school was closed for winter break, but Jake knew Sarah well enough by now to suspect she would be there anyway, working on lesson plans or organizing supplies with the kind of focused intensity she brought to everything. He found her in her classroom, surrounded by boxes of art supplies and what appeared to be half the contents of the school library. She was wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she looked younger and less formidable than she had the night before when she had systematically dismantled his emotional defenses in front of half the town. "Jake," she said when she noticed him standing in the doorway, "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me after last night." "I wasn't sure either," Jake admitted, stepping into the classroom but maintaining a careful distance. "But I've been thinking about what you said, and I have some questions." Sarah set down the stack of books she had been sorting and turned to face him fully. "I owe you an apology first. I had no right to ambush you in public like that. My frustration got the better of my judgment, and I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," Jake said quickly. "You were right about everything. That's what I came to talk to you about." Relief flickered across Sarah's face, followed by something that looked like nervousness. "What did you want to know?" Jake moved closer, settling himself on one of the small student desks in a way that would have been comical if the conversation hadn't been so serious. "I want to know what you meant when you said this was about two people who are tired of being afraid. I want to know what you're proposing exactly." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her attention apparently focused on a bulletin board displaying her students' holiday artwork. When she spoke, her voice was careful and measured, as if she were navigating through a minefield. "I've been thinking about that too," she said. "And I think what I was proposing was friendship. Real friendship, with someone who understands what it's like to be scared of getting close to people. Someone to practice being honest with, being vulnerable with, without all the pressure that comes with romantic expectations." "Friendship," Jake repeated, testing the word like someone learning a new language. "When was the last time you had a friend, Jake? I don't mean someone you drink beer with occasionally or talk cattle prices with. I mean someone who knows what keeps you awake at night, who you can call when you're having a bad day, who cares about more than just the successful public version of yourself." Jake thought about the question seriously, running through his mental inventory of relationships and coming up empty. "I can't remember," he admitted. "Maybe never, actually." "Me neither," Sarah said. "I had David, but he was my fiancé before he was my friend, so I never really learned how to separate romantic feelings from genuine caring. And before him, I was always too focused on grades and achievements to invest much time in friendships." The parallel between their experiences was both comforting and sobering. Jake realized that Sarah understood his isolation, not just intellectually, but from her own lived experience. She wasn't offering to fix him or save him, but to figure things out alongside him. "So what would this friendship look like?" Jake asked. Sarah smiled then, the first genuinely relaxed expression he had seen from her since he had arrived. "I have no idea. I was hoping we could figure it out as we go along. But maybe we could start with something simple, like having dinner together once a week and actually talking about things that matter." "Things that matter?" "Books, dreams, fears, embarrassing childhood stories, opinions about important issues. The kind of conversations that help you really know someone instead of just knowing about them." Jake found himself nodding despite his nervousness. The idea of having someone to talk to, really talk to, was more appealing than he wanted to admit.
"And this would be just friendship?"
"No romantic complications or expectations?" "Just friendship," Sarah confirmed. "Although I should probably warn you that I'm not very good at it. I tend to be nosy and opinionated, and I have strong feelings about everything from education policy to the proper way to make coffee." "I make terrible coffee," Jake said, "so your strong feelings might come in handy." For the first time since he had arrived, Sarah laughed, and the sound seemed to chase away some of the awkward tension that had been hanging between them. "See? We're solving problems already." They agreed to start with dinner at Jake's ranch the following Saturday, a plan that seemed both momentous and completely ordinary. As Jake drove home, he tried to remember the last time he had looked forward to anything that didn't involve cattle or ranch business. The anticipation was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Saturday arrived with the kind of brilliant winter sunshine that made Montana look like a postcard from heaven. Jake spent the morning cleaning his house with an attention to detail that would have impressed a professional housekeeper, and the afternoon preparing what he hoped would be an edible meal. He was a competent camp cook, used to feeding ranch hands during roundup season, but cooking for Sarah felt different, more personal. When she arrived at 7 o'clock, carrying a bottle of wine and a homemade apple pie, Jake realized he had been holding his breath all day without realizing it. Sarah looked comfortable and casual in wool pants and a thick sweater, but there was something about the way she took in his home that suggested she was seeing it with new eyes. "It's even more beautiful in the daylight," she said, standing in the living room, and taking in the view of snow-covered mountains through the large windows. "But it still feels like it's waiting for something."
Waiting for what?
Sarah turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "Life. Noise. The kind of chaos that comes with people who really live in a place instead of just occupying it." The observation stung a little, mostly because it was accurate. Jake had maintained his house like a museum, keeping it clean and organized, but never really making it feel like home. Even his personal belongings seemed temporary, as if he were always ready to pack up and leave at a moment's notice. Dinner was less awkward than Jake had expected, though that wasn't saying much given his extremely low expectations. Sarah was an engaging conversationalist, curious about ranch life and full of stories about her students and her life before Montana. She asked thoughtful questions about cattle raising and land management, and she listened to his answers with a kind of focused attention that made him feel like his expertise actually mattered. But it was after dinner, when they were sitting by the fire with coffee and pie, that the conversation took on the depth that Sarah had promised. Somehow, they found themselves talking about their childhoods, their dreams, and the experiences that had shaped them into the cautious adults they had become. Jake found himself telling Sarah about his mother's death, about watching her fade away year by year until she was just a shadow of the vibrant woman she had once been. He talked about his father's cold disappointment, the way Samuel Morrison had turned love into a transaction and affection into a reward that had to be earned through perfect performance. In return, Sarah told him about growing up as the daughter of immigrants who had sacrificed everything for her education, about the pressure to be perfect and successful that had driven her to excel academically but left her emotionally unprepared for real relationships. She talked about David's betrayal, about the humiliation of discovering that the man she thought she knew had been lying to her for months. "The worst part wasn't even the affair," Sarah said, staring into the fire as she spoke. "It was realizing that I had been so focused on being the perfect fiancé that I had never bothered to figure out if David was actually the right person for me. I was so busy trying to meet his expectations that I never stopped to consider whether he was meeting mine." "What would you have looked for?" Jake asked. "If you had been paying attention to your own needs instead of just trying to be perfect?" Sarah was quiet for a long time, considering the question. "Honesty. Kindness. Someone who is genuinely interested in who I am instead of just impressed by what I can do. Someone who wanted to build a life with me instead of just wanting me to fit into the life he had already planned." Jake nodded, recognizing the description as everything he had never thought to want but suddenly realized he needed. "I never thought about it that way. The women who proposed to me were all focused on what kind of husband I would be, what kind of life we could build together. But none of them seemed particularly interested in who I actually am underneath all the ranch owner success story. Is that why you said no, because you didn't feel like they really knew you?" Jake considered the question, trying to be honest with himself, as well as with Sarah. "Partly. But mostly, I said no because I was terrified they would get to know me and decide I wasn't worth the trouble. It seemed safer to reject them before they could reject me." "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," Sarah observed. "It's probably the most honest thing I've ever said to anyone." The admission hung between them like a gift, precious and fragile. Jake realized that this was what Sarah had meant about practicing vulnerability, about learning to trust another person with the truth about yourself. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. They talked until nearly midnight, covering everything from their favorite books to their fears about the future. Jake learned that Sarah wrote poetry in her spare time, that she had traveled through Southeast Asia after college, and that she was considering applying for a master's degree in education administration. Sarah discovered that Jake read voraciously, that he had always wanted to travel but had never found the courage to leave the ranch for more than a few days, and that he sometimes thought about what it would be like to have children, but had convinced himself he would be a terrible father. When Sarah finally left, promising to return the following Saturday, Jake felt as if something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. For the first time in years, he had spent an evening with another person, without feeling the need to perform or pretend. He had been himself, completely and honestly. And Sarah had not only accepted that person, but seemed to genuinely enjoy his company. The weeks that followed, established a pattern that became the highlight of Jake's week. Every Saturday, Sarah would come to the ranch for dinner and conversation. Sometimes they cooked together, experimenting with recipes from different cultures as part of Sarah's ongoing education project.
The Paris, the Walder-eyed webbing.
Sometimes they just talked, sharing stories and opinions and dreams with the kind of openness that Jake had never experienced before. Sarah introduced Jake to books he would never have discovered on his own, contemporary fiction and poetry that expanded his understanding of the world beyond Montana. In return, Jake taught Sarah about ranch life, showing her how to read weather patterns and identify different breeds of cattle. He taught her to drive his truck, to throw hay to the cattle, and to appreciate the subtle beauty of a sunrise over snow-covered pasture. More importantly, they taught each other how to be vulnerable without being defensive, how to disagree without taking disagreement personally, and how to care about someone without trying to change them. It was a masterclass in emotional intimacy, conducted by two people who were learning the lessons together. By March, Jake realized that his life had become fundamentally different. He looked forward to their Saturday dinners with an anticipation that carried him through the week. He found himself thinking about things Sarah had said, considering her perspective on issues he had never bothered to examine before. He caught himself saving up stories and observations to share with her, editing his experiences through the lens of what would make her laugh or make her think. More surprisingly, Jake discovered that he was becoming a better friend to other people as well. The emotional skills he was developing with Sarah began to spill over into his other relationships. He started having real conversations with his neighbors instead of just talking about weather and cattle prices. He began to see the people in his community as individuals, with their own complex inner lives rather than just familiar faces who happened to live nearby. The change didn't go unnoticed. Helen Gardner cornered him at the feed store one afternoon and announced that he seemed different, more relaxed and approachable than he had been in years. Bill Murphy mentioned that Jake was becoming quite the conversationalist, actually contributing to discussions instead of just listening politely and making his escape at the first opportunity. But it was Rex who provided the most telling evidence of Jake's transformation. The border collie, always sensitive to his master's moods, seemed more relaxed and playful than he had been in years. Jake realized that his dog had been absorbing his loneliness and tension, and that Rex's improved spirits were a reflection of his own growing contentment. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Jake began to understand what Sarah had meant about choosing connection over isolation. He was still the same person, with the same basic personality, and the same fundamental values. But he was no longer the man who talked to his cattle because he had no one else to share his thoughts with. He was someone with a friend, someone who mattered to another person, someone whose happiness was connected to something beyond his own solitary satisfaction. The realization was both wonderful and terrifying, because Jake was beginning to suspect that what he felt for Sarah Chen went far beyond friendship, and he wasn't sure either of them was ready for that complication. Spring arrived in Montana like a cautious promise, with patches of green grass emerging from the melting snow, and the first tentative wildflowers beginning to bloom in the protected valleys. The change of seasons brought with it a restlessness that Jake Morrison had never experienced before, a sense that something important was about to happen, even though he couldn't quite identify what it might be. His Saturday dinners with Sarah had become the anchor point of his week, the one constant in a life that was otherwise undergoing subtle but fundamental changes. What had started as friendship born of mutual loneliness had deepened into something more complex and precious than either of them had expected. Jake found himself thinking about Sarah at odd moments throughout his days, wondering what she would think about the way morning light painted the mountains, or how she would react to a particularly amusing story he had heard in town. But as their friendship deepened, Jake became increasingly aware of an undercurrent of attraction that he was trying very hard to ignore. It wasn't just that Sarah was beautiful, though he had begun to notice the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, or the graceful way she moved her hands when she was explaining something she cared about. It was something deeper and more dangerous, the growing realization that he was falling in love with her. The recognition terrified him more than any bronco he had ever tried to break, or any blizzard he had weathered alone on the range. Love was the one risk Jake had sworn never to take again, the one vulnerability he had promised himself he would avoid at all costs. But Sarah Chen had slipped past his defenses so gradually that he hadn't noticed the invasion until it was too late to retreat. The crisis came on a Saturday in late April when Sarah arrived at the ranch looking uncharacteristically subdued. She went through the motions of their usual dinner conversation, but Jake could sense something weighing on her mind like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon.